Hey, thank you so much for having me share with you. And first of all, I'm so sorry, very sorry for all that you're going through, and my heart is with you. I went through this exact same thing in very similar ways. And shooting in Columbine bears so many resemblances to this that it touches emotional places in me as well. So, what I hope to share with you today, and it's just very brief, but when asked, I thought, what are a few of the things that we learned in the immediate aftermath and that I wish that I had more clearly in my mind. And by immediate aftermath, I don't really mean the week of the shooting. I think about the time the news people go away and the funerals begin to end is really when a lot of us will first experience so much of what we have to encounter and deal with, because the reality sort of sets in that our friends aren't coming back anymore. They're not coming back. My apologies for that. My friends aren't coming back, and my um, child isn't ever going to sleep in that bed again. And even if you're not dealing with those who are immediately affected, it ripples in powerful ways. And so the first thing I would say to you is you are first responders in that sense. You are first responders in your own way. And we had counselors that some kids wanted to talk to, and we had some kids that we thought needed to talk to counselors. But the reality is, most of them talked to teachers and youth ministers and administrators and people that they knew and already trusted. And there was a big lesson in that for us. And I will say that to you as well, that while those bridges can be built after a big tragedy, it's better if those bridges are built before. And so a lesson going forward, that the better relationships we have in those ways, that a kid feels comfortable talking to someone in a position of trust, the better it goes for them. And you are equipped to do it. You don't have to be, yes, there's needs for counselors, but you don't have to have much except a couple of things. I'll tell you what the very basics are to me. One is, and I'm sure most of you learn this in school or in other ways, but just good reflective listening skills. You don't need to have answers. In fact, it's not a good time to have answers. And I know there's a lot of politics that goes along, and I'm not saying that's good or bad. There's a lot of we don't want this to happen ever again, which is great and true. But you don't have to have answers to all those things. You don't have to have answers to big questions about God or our policy. A person that's in crisis or that's experiencing turmoil emotionally, while those may be issues that they're aware of and speak to, the real turmoil is deeper than that in their own personal life. And the main thing you need is just good reflective listening skills like you learned wherever, not the stereotypical ones. What I hear you saying is, but to be able to say, it sounds like this is still affecting you really deeply. And I can certainly understand why, because it's doing that for me too. What's the one thing that keeps coming back to you? Questions like that. I do care about those things, but what I care about most is you. And you don't seem like you're doing okay. So tell me, what's the one thing that most makes it that is making you cry right now? What is that thing? And to be able to get to the bottom of their own grief. And the second point is, don't judge grief. And that's something we really had to learn, because like many of you, we were dealing with young people who were at least a few rungs, removed from the actual trauma, and some of them seemed more upset than young people and families who were very deeply affected sometimes. And there would be those who wanted to judge that. Why is she so upset? What does it matter to him? Kind of a thing. And we had counselors really clear with us on that. Counselors counseling us. Don't judge grief. Don't judge it. There's a million answers to that question. Everyone has a different level of empathy and concern, and what they see on the TV affects them differently. Everyone has different levels of unresolved grief in their own life, and these things touch on that as well. And that's not bad or good. That just is, and it has to get resolved, however, somehow, in a healthy life. And if this brings up their own grief that their grandmother just passed away, or that someone they know committed suicide, then so be it. That's okay. That these feelings bring up the same questions. I think another point that was very important for us is to recognize that as teachers and administrators, as youth ministers and pastors who were dealing with these issues, we needed a place to go so that we could deal with our own feelings from having to talk about it all the time. And we didn't want that to be with the teenagers. We wanted that to be separate. So we had set up, once a week, once every 2 weeks, just a little check-in for anybody who wanted to sit down and say, wow, you know what one of the kids said in class today, that sort of thing. And because it touches us too, and this sort of stuff rips us apart as well. So I really encourage you to make those spaces for yourselves. And in one of those meetings that we had, a conversation came up that I think is a little bit of a great parable for some of this. And a man named John, who was one of the youth ministry volunteers at our church, who did a lot of stuff, but also had a daughter in the school who was very deeply affected, not shot or anything, but lost a friend and had some real saw some difficult things, She got up one morning and I don't know, it was middle of the night. So it was like 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, something like that. Walked into her parents' room and said, I'm going to the store. I need to buy hair color. And her dad, being woken from sleep, is like, no, you're not. No, you're not. You got your driver's license 3 months ago. You're not going out at midnight to get hair color. No one needs hair color. And she's like, I need to color my hair before school tomorrow. I'm going to the store. And he's like, you're not going to the store by yourself to buy hair color. She's like, well, I'm going. And he said, well, I'm going with you. And she didn't necessarily want him to go, but he had a moment of realization, and he said, you know what? I totally respect you need to color your hair. I'm asking you to respect, I need to not lay here and wonder if you're going to be okay. So I will drive you. You can go in by yourself, but I'm driving you. And they went. And there's two things that came from that for us. One is the realization that this was a great example of how the young people in the community, there's a real helpless feeling when stuff like this happens, and they feel helpless to control their safety. They feel helpless to control what happened. They feel helpless to control what might happen, and there was a lot of looking for ways we can control, and that comes out in speaking out on things. That comes out in, we had a lot of tattoos and hair color changes, and that's the truth. And we realized that was just grabbing onto things that they could control and could give them a sense of control. And that's healthy. There's nothing wrong with that. And in big ways and small, I think respecting that is the right thing. And this seems small, but we had these conversations, teachers just being willing to say, hey, we have a test tomorrow and there's 2 essay questions here on the test. I'm going to give you this third one in advance. There's that. So you have to answer 2 out of 3. It gave them a little bit of a break, and it gave them some choices, simple things like that when you see kids' stress level in school rising, simple ways to say, this is due on Friday. I'm not going to be grading this weekend, so I'll also allow you to turn it in Monday if you like. Those seem like small things, and I'm not saying, just be lenient, but I am saying that sense of having control is a real, it's important to a person who's experienced a trauma, that their life is not out of control. And what I think John did that was so amazing is that he recognized it and he walked with his daughter. He accompanied her through her turmoil instead of let her go off on her own, And I think that's really powerful. And that is, I think the root of all this really is that a young person is in utter despair and no one knows. That's why you have a person do this to begin with. And it's what we really want to avoid, creating a cycle of that. And so be willing to step into it. I really encourage you, when you see a kid that's just, their pattern of behavior is clearly changed. I know we've all been taught these things, but after something so traumatic as this, it's a really good idea not to rationalize away and go, well, she'll be fine. It might be a really important time to say, hey, what's going on with you? I noticed you didn't do too well on this, and I think this is your first not A. So what's troubling you? And see what happens. So there's that. I do think there is in this aftermath a lot of, don't, keep your thoughts and prayers. And as Catholic schools, I think it's especially important to think about that and address that. As a person who experienced a tragedy, I can tell you it was the thoughts and prayers of our community and our nation that got us through. I've had kids say directly to me, I stayed sane and I stayed healthy because of my faith in God and because of other people's prayers for me and because the support that poured in to us, and all those things are terribly important, and they begin to evaporate after a couple of weeks, and so I think all the more important that as a community you do pray for each other, you do talk to each other, you do create that sense of a safety net of support that hey, you're not going to fall lower than that, and praying helps. Statistically speaking, faithful young people went through our. It was just a experience that those who had faith fared better than those who didn't, and there was a lot of suicides and other things that happened after, and that's not a pretty thing. It's not. It's just not. It's not good or bad. None of this. It's just it is. And so here's what you do. I think we begin to create a sense of safety and community, of hope and faith with our young people. Don't be afraid to say, I'm praying for you. Don't be afraid to say, we're praying for those who were affected. Don't be afraid to step into that space, even if secular world pushes back a little. And that's my last thing. This is just my answer, and I'm going to give it pretty quickly because now is not the time to really dive into some of those big answers and questions. And I know that they come up immediately in the news. They come up immediately in young people's minds. It's good to have some answers. I agree with that. But the real debate kind of comes a little bit later. And the real reality is if people are grieving, and you're talking about counseling with those in crisis, with those who were affected, with those who are emotionally affected by what happened, they're not really interested in, a policy decision. They're really interested in they feel dangerously unsafe, they're frightened, and they're traumatized. That's the first thing to deal with. And it's a little bit manipulative sometimes on the news when you put a microphone in front of somebody's face who's in that exact moment. That doesn't mean what they're saying isn't true. I'm definitely not taking sides one way or the other on any of that. It was just important for us to create safety for our kids who were in turmoil so that they had freedom to just feel their own feelings and be who they are. And when they did ask questions like, how could God let this happen? You do ultimately have to have answers to all these things. And so I will share in super briefly my answer. It's not an easy answer, but it is my answer. When a young person says that to me, I do say, in a very difficult way, it is events like this and days like this that remind me how real God is. Because it says in the very first book of the Bible, the very first book in Genesis, it says, you and I are created in the image and likeness of God. We are created in the image of the creator of the universe. And you can see it. No matter what anyone tells you, we are not just the most evolved animal. No other animal, no other species, no other organism reasons like we do, creates like we do, not to get food or shelter, but just for the joy of creating. And we have a creative ability and a destructive ability that is unique to human beings because we are created in the image of God. And that carries a responsibility. We're responsible for that. We can create and we can destroy. And this is a horrible, destructive thing that someone does, and it's a horrible, destructive thing that we're capable of. And to me, that's not evidence that there's not God. It's evidence that there's a responsibility in being created in the image of God that we are called to help each other achieve and live up to and recognize. So my prayers are really with you. That is what people can do, continue to pray and to support. And we got sent a lot of food and a lot of cards, and the kids kept all those. A lot of kids kept all those. So You can do that for those who are most affected, and I think it's even more important to do things like that after the cameras have gone and after it's not as big a story anymore and people have an enormous hole in their heart. As a community, continue to step into that void and be present to those who were so powerfully affected. Thanks for listening. This is just one person's perspective, but I've really enjoyed being with you, and I hope the very best for you. God bless you guys.